Okay, well, let's get this started, and we have many of our guests online, and I hope you can hear us. Just to give you an idea of what's going on for the folks at home, we're just going to swivel the camera around to show what we got going on here locally. So we're at the Archimedes Healthcare Security Week at our annual event. So hope you all are having a good time. And again, we're having a simulcast with our online UC San Francisco, Stanford, CERSI, now joint with the Archimedes Center for Healthcare and Medical Device Cybersecurity today. This is going to be a somewhat unusual event. This is the first time we've done a simulcast, a live simulcast. We've had a number of events in the past where my guest and I are co-located. Andrew Carney and I, Andrew from ARPA-H, we had an event last year that we pre-recorded and then had for the CERSI event, but today it's going to be live. So we're taking a big risk with all the AV and all the various internet communications, but looking forward to this event. So today, this is sponsored strictly by the UCSF-Stanford CERSI and Archimedes. This is not an FDA event today, just to be on record there. So this is an independent seminar today. And we've had a number of guests on the program about medical device cybersecurity today. It's my honor to have Naomi Schwartz from MedCrypt, and she's going to be giving updates on FDA and her year in review with lessons learned from cybersecurity submissions. Naomi is Vice President of Services at MedCrypt. Oops. And we're going to move forward with the slides. Already we're having AV issues. So luckily we have a backup to move forward. Next slide, please. Yeah, but Naomi, welcome to the program. If you don't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. So I'm Naomi Schwartz. I'm the VP of Services at MedCrypt. Prior to my time at MedCrypt, I was at FDA, so I am able to talk about FDA perspectives, but I am not representing FDA. Kevin was also at FDA. Most of my work at FDA was regulation of diabetes devices, which are very interoperable and therefore also need a lot of security. So cybersecurity became very important to the diabetes group. And in our reviews, we wanted to make sure that cybersecurity was front and center. And because there wasn't statutory authority at the time, we said, hey, if we're going to have class 2 pathways for these devices, let's put special controls in place that say you have to make it secure, and let's make them general enough that you can find the right way to secure it without us telling you how, which is important because the regulator doesn't always know the best way and it doesn't always keep up with state of the art. Prior to my time at FDA, I built radars for the Department of Defense. So I have built very complex systems and I understand medical device manufacturers' pain in finding the right ways to manage requirements. Kevin?
Yeah, so next slide, please. All right. Whoa, that's a lot of text. I'm Kevin Fu from Northeastern University. I'm a professor at Northeastern University in electrical computer engineering and the Corey College of Computer Sciences and the Department of Bioengineering. So we have a very experiential learning-based philosophy where I ask my students, all my students are actually online today, joining us remotely from my medical device security course. But I like to have my students immersed in the laboratory working with real devices, and that's part of the ethos at Northeastern. I'm also the director of Archimedes Center for Healthcare and Medical Device Cybersecurity. Next slide, please. Oh, and while we're moving forward, yes, as Naomi mentioned, I too am former FDA. I was previously the acting director of medical device cybersecurity within CDRH.
So let's really briefly touch on what is going on in regulatory land. Congress finally passed something called the Patch Act with the 2023 Omnibus. And the Patch Act said, first of all, let's talk about what is a cyber device that we're going to be regulating and then how we're going to do it. They defined a cyber device as 3 characteristics that are ANDed. These are all necessary for these rules to apply. Can you have a device that actually has only 2 of these 3 characteristics? Yes, you can. Are they very common? No, they're not. So what is a cyber device? First of all, it has software that is included on it. Lots of devices have software. If you have a scalpel, it's probably not got software on it, but a lot of other devices do. The second characteristic has the ability to connect to the internet. That doesn't mean you meant for it to connect to the internet. That means I have some capacity to make it do it. That could mean I plug a flipper 0 into your USB port, and now it is on the internet. Don't think you're out of, scope if you have a USB port, but you didn't want it to connect to the internet. You're covered. And the third, actually, I think is somewhat redundant with the first. It contains technological characteristics that could be vulnerable to cybersecurity threats. Well, if you've got software, you're probably vulnerable in some way. Maybe I have to use a Dremel tool to cut your thing open to get to the connectors to make it vulnerable. Don't think I won't do it. I love my Dremel tool. Next. So what then is applied to you if you fall under these characteristics? If you are a cyber device, what does FDA tell you you have to do? And this is no longer a question of recommended practice. This is a statutory requirement. The law says thou shalt do, and you will do it. And FDA will demand that you do it. The first piece is that you have to submit to the secretary, that's of HHS. That really means FDA because the secretary is not reading your submissions. A plan to monitor and identify and manage and address cybersecurity vulnerabilities. What do I mean by that? All of the things, right? You get a signal from a complaint, and that's part of your management process. You have to handle that. You get your SBOM and run it through a tool, and it comes back and says, you have 2013 vulnerable components or components with multiple vulnerabilities. And you're like, oh, great, what do I do now? You better triage that. You have a device that's been on market for 12 years and it has even more CVEs. You're supposed to be managing that too.
Oh, Naomi, I'm going to interrupt for a second. Whenever you use an acronym like CVE, what is a CVE?
It's a vulnerability. It's the National Vulnerability Database's way of tracking these common vulnerabilities. And there are lots of other acronyms that we'll use too. So please stop me if I do that again, because I will.
I'm the acronym police. And also on an administrative note, the people online, there should be a Q&A function. If you want to submit a question, it'll go into the queue that we'll see how many questions we can get to. And for Archimedes attendees who have a question, just raise your hand and we'll pass a microphone.
In addition to that, not only are you monitoring your vulnerabilities, but you might have to tell people about them. So in my time at FDA, we had to deal with this troublesome situation called Urgent 11, where the poor regulatory team got to phone call lots of manufacturers and say, hey, I noticed in your submission that you mentioned this particular software package. Are you still using that? And does it affect your system? And are you vulnerable because of Urgent 11? And everyone went, what? Why is FDA calling me about this? And how did you figure out that I have that? Because you don't have my software bill of materials. True story. We just searched through the database and found keywords that matched, and then we called people. And that is not the most efficient way for things to work. So that will be getting better in the future. But they did do it. And at some point, if your vulnerability actually entails patient safety risk, you might have to notify people about it. So you will see FDA coordinating with manufacturers to put out notifications. You will also see manufacturers and saying, hey, you know what, like Kevin did in the past, I was mucking around with your system and I found something that doesn't look quite right. You should have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure or CVD process. It should be public facing so that a researcher can go to your website and go click, click, click. Oh, this is your process. I'm going to follow it. I'm going to share with you the details of what I did, how I did it, and what my results were. And you're going to respond to me. And we're going to have some interaction in a timely fashion. And I'm not going to have to call Big Brother, CISA, FDA, or whomever to get them to intervene. Now, if you fail to do this, they will intervene. I've sat at that table and it was not fun. But they expect you to do these things. The second major element is that you need to be designing, developing, and maintaining processes and procedures to make sure that there's a reasonable assurance that that device remains. Now we're going to get three important words here: safe, effective, and secure. It used to be that FDA's bar for medical devices was safety and effectiveness, and that was it. That third word is added now, and there's statutory weight behind it. We're not playing around. It has to also be secure. Safety and effectiveness are only assured by security if your thing is connected in some way, or can be made to connect even if it wasn't intended to. So you need to have a reasonable, what's reasonable, we can talk about that, justified cycle for maintaining your system, for dealing with problems that arise. If I have a bug in my software, I got to patch it. If there's a bug in the software I use in my software, I need to update that software component. FDA expects you to do that reasonably quickly. What is reasonable? It depends. You hear that from the regulator all the time, and there's a reason for it. If you have a death incident associated with it, there's a different bar of it depends than if you have a phone call that says, my thing isn't working right and it's inconvenient for me. So the it depends comes back to safety to some extent. The second is that if you do have something go wrong, as soon as possible, out of cycle, you got to fix it. Now, the post-market guidance tells you what kind of timeframes you should be looking at. And again, it feeds back to other elements of the quality system like MDR reporting. If you have a death or somebody loses a limb or other serious adverse event, you have a very different timeline than, oh, user inconvenience. Oh, I got to reboot my system every 10 minutes. Depending on what your system is, that may really matter. So those are the top two. The third one is that you have to provide to the secretary, again, this is really to FDA, a software bill of materials. And FDA is looking for a machine-readable software bill of materials. So we're talking about specific machine-readable formats. We're not talking about an Excel spreadsheet or a PDF file where half the fields are truncated and nobody can actually tell what CVE you're about to list for that particular software component. I've seen lots of those, and I don't want to read a JSON file myself either, but like, you got to be able to actually get into the thing and rack and stack and sort it and figure out what you're looking at. So what do you send to FDA with your submission? A machine readable Cyclone DX or SPDX file, not an Excel spreadsheet, and please not a truncated PDF. The fourth one is tricky. This leaves the appearance of a wide open door for additional regulation, and it's complying with other requirements such as the secretary may require, anything. This is really, really open. What does it really mean? It means that in current administrative speak, if you want to write a new regulation based on this statute, you can say tomorrow, oh, and by the way, you also have to give me VEX, for example, vulnerability exchange data associated with a particular vulnerability for your device. They could create a new regulation for that. And you say, wow, that could create a whole snowball avalanche type effect of new regulations. Why do I think that won't happen? For one thing, the current administration has stated for every new regulation that any regulatory body in the government issues, they have to cut out 10 old ones. Wow, I don't know how you do that at FDA. It would actually be quite challenging. Also note that every time you have a new de novo that's granted or a new PMA that is approved, you have to create a new regulation for that device. So unless the PMA is under an already existing classification, you're going to have new regulations happening because of innovation in the field. So that means you probably can't write 150 new cybersecurity regulations just because you want to. The other aspect about cybersecurity that's really important is that this has been a largely bipartisan activity from Congress recently. And so you're going to see a continuation of this harmonized approach. to cybersecurity regulation, it is not going to be chaotic or scattershot. It's going to be carefully thought out. That's my prediction. We shall see if I'm right. Cross his fingers. So when you're dealing with this regulatory body, what are you seeing from them? What is FDA going to subject you to? We thought it would be fun to try and find a way to talk about what FDA is demanding through something more interactive. We called it 524 bingo. B is for SBOM, I is for testing, N is for vulnerability management. We're not going to jump to the next slide, but G is for labeling and O is for controls. These are 5 of the most common areas where medical device manufacturers submitting to FDA miss something that they're supposed to include. Supposed to include being based on the guidance, which is much more comprehensive than the statute in terms of what does FDA want to see. Noting that the guidance says it's a list of recommendations, whereas the statute says this is the law. So the number one place that FDA is complaining about what's submitted to them is SBOM. Now, SBOM is part of the law. It says you must submit it. What's your favorite one for SBOM, Kevin?
Oh, my favorite. I think an interesting one would be, we have no known vulnerabilities for anything in our SBOM. Because to me, that's a huge red flag. We all know that there's lots of third-party software, and it's not unusual to find lots of vulnerabilities. And in my opinion, it's totally okay to have a vulnerability as long as it's not uncontrolled.
Right.
You'll have protections in place, but something that really raises my eyebrows when you see one of these absolutes of, we have no vulnerabilities, then you know it's falsely generated.
That's exactly right. And that's a very common attribute to things that FDA sees in submissions. You either didn't give them one at all, in which case, if you're submitting through the eStar template, that's the electronic submission template for 510Ks, and it's mandatory now. If you don't give them a machine-readable SBOM, it won't let you submit it. But if you give them one that's just a gobbledygook, file that has some text in it that's not actually an SBOM, they're going to call you out on that last bullet under B, that you did not provide an SBOM according to 524B, subpart B3 of the Act, and say your infusion pump. The regulatory submission does not include an SBOM. Why do I need an SBOM for an infusion pump? Because if you have a vulnerability and I can take remote control of that, I can dose somebody with a drug that could kill them. Why would I do that? I wouldn't, but you could, and that's the problem. FDA wants to know that you're managing the risks associated with that device's intended use and the environment in which it's being used.
So while we're on the topic of software bill of material, SBOM, we have a number of healthcare delivery organizations in the audience. They're not going to be regulating the device, but they too have a role for SBOM. We call it ingestion. So maybe you could just mention a few of the use cases of an SBOM. FDA has a very specific use case.
Sure.
But there are other use cases.
Yeah, so if you are a practitioner and you are using this medical device and it's going into your ecosystem, you're probably never going to look at the SBOM. But if you are a manager of information technology going into the hospital, and I know we have a few such people here today, you really do care about what's in your inventory. And how do you know what's associated with that? How do you know what version it is? And once you know what version it is that version actually up to date? Does it need to be patched? Did the manufacturer ever tell you there was a patch? Do they maybe need somebody to prod them and demand that they patch it? You won't know that if you don't know what's on it. Now you can go scan it yourself. That takes some effort and some tools and some expertise. You may come up with a different SBOM than the manufacturer has. True story, this does happen. Depending on the tooling you use, you may come up with a different SBOM. But if the manufacturer is giving you the SBOM, if you use model contract language and demand that as part of procurement, they give you an SBOM, and I know that people are doing this, you will have hopefully some tooling that lets you review that software bill of materials, hopefully some real-time warning that says, hey, I've got a vulnerability in my infusion pump. And you'll be able to say, do I want to take it offline because the vulnerability is going to cause problems? Or do you want to call up the medical device manufacturer and find out, oh, that actually only pertains, true story, to a Ring doorbell. That vulnerability is truly affecting the software component that I have, but it's only in the implementation of the Ring doorbell, not in my defibrillator. I'm not kidding. This actually happened. They were tracking this in their vulnerability list, and I said, stop tracking it. It's not affecting you. Last time I checked, you don't have a doorbell. But as an ingester of this, you want to know what software is on this device and is it vulnerable? Do I have to worry? Is there a risk in how I'm using it? Now, if you don't have other attributes in the software bill of materials, you may have ambiguity. What's the vendor? If the software name is common and used in multiple different vendors' products, you might not know which one it is. So you may come back with a list of vulnerabilities that don't actually affect the device. Or you may not know that you have vulnerabilities because you're tracking the wrong one. That is why FDA is asking for all of these specific minimum elements that NTIA laid out.
Now, Naomi, although this is Title 524B, of course, this is a combination 524B as well, pre-market guidance. In the pre-market guidance that was recently finalized a couple of years ago, it talks about with the known vulnerabilities, you could either put it in your SBOM or you could have a separate way. Maybe you could comment a little about that.
Sure. So the machine readable formats for SBOM have more or less flexibility in them to include special fields. You can include specific fields like known vulnerabilities associated with a component using certain special fields if that's what you choose to do. Or you can give your machine readable SBOM to a spreadsheet mechanism for tracking for each component that's listed in your SBOM. What do you know about it and when did you know it? For example, end of support information. I mentioned it earlier today, but good luck getting an end of support date out of Apple or Google for your OS on your mobile phone or your MacBook or Chromebook, because typically they haven't shared that kind of detail. Maybe they haven't even made the plan yet. If that's true for those kinds of developers, what about open source software, where you may have a consortium or a single individual who's written the package and may or may not be maintaining it? FDA is not saying go out and make them give you the answer. They're saying, what are you going to do about it if there is no support? It's situational awareness. So when you put a list of vulnerabilities into a spreadsheet associated with each component of your software bill of materials, you're telling FDA, I have situational awareness. I know what's going on in my ecosystem and I can do something about it if something comes up that I didn't already know about. Does that mean you have to have real-time monitoring? No. Is it helpful? Oh, yeah.
So moving on, and even beyond SBOM, this morning we talked about how, what was it, about 10 years ago on the FDA website, there was no guidance at the time, and the guidance was get along with your vendor. And I kept a screenshot of this, right? So if you ever want to see the real screenshot, it actually exists. It said get along with your vendors. Today, it's, of course, very different. Now, you might have a medical device manufacturer who submitted something 5 years ago, and they said, well, FDA never asked about cybersecurity. We don't need to do that. What do you think they can expect?
Yeah, this feels a little like that book, What to Expect When You're Expecting, right? What do you do about the fact that you have a system that hasn't been reviewed in a long time, but now you've made some change that crosses the threshold and it requires a new 510K? Or you haven't made any changes in a few years, but you have a class 3 device and you need to submit a PMA supplement. You'd better be prepared for FDA to say, we haven't reviewed cybersecurity ever or in a long time for this. If you have it all together, get started right now because they're going to ask you for it. If you have it put together, just double check that you have all of the components that FDA asks for. Go back to that guidance and literally use it as a checklist. Because if you miss one piece of it, that reviewer who is using their smart template to be as efficient and predictable as possible is going to click the box that says, no, you did not include this element, or you included it, but it's not adequate. That's a common theme in here. You did not do it, or you did it, and it's inadequate. FDA has a lot of flexibility about what they call inadequate. They're supposed to only ask for what they need. And they typically try to do that. But they will tell you, I did not see evidence that you fuzz tested something. And if you didn't fuzz test it, please go back and do that. And if you don't know what fuzz testing is, it really means, do I test that the inputs that are going into my software lead to a predictable output? And if I send in a bad input, I should get an error message, not a crash.
All right. Well, I was going to say, let's move on to testing, but I think that helps sort of highlight, we're not going to be able to get through every element of this bingo game,
right?
But at least we touched on testing a little bit. Maybe we should move on to vulnerability management.
Sure. This goes back to, in part, to your software bill of materials, right? If I have a vulnerable component in my device, I need to go in and look at the risks associated with it. It may be that there are no real risks other than to my business. And yes, you should be considering business risk. If you're not, your bosses will be very angry with you. But you should be doing a risk management exercise anytime you find a vulnerability. It may be that you don't have to do something immediately. It may be that you might never have to do something about it, but you had better write down why you decided that, because FDA may come asking. But bottom line, you need to be prepared to react. And you need to make sure you're following the post-market guidance to make sure you understand whether or not you're required to submit a correction or removal, also known as a recall or an 806 action.
Do we want to talk a little bit about 806 exemption?
Sure. So there are circumstances under which you may be exempt. FDA may choose to not enforce the 806 requirement that if you have a problem, you need to issue a correction or removal. There are 4 criteria under which you may avoid having to submit a recall, an 806 action with FDA, and those are ANDed. The easiest one to tell you is if you are a member of an ISAC or an ISAO, and then if you do not have a death or serious adverse event, and if you can inform your user base within 30 days that something is going on, and be very careful about how and what you inform them about, and you can patch within 60 days, you are exempt. All of those are ANDed. If you have a death, the whole thing falls apart. If you are not a member of an ISAC or an ISAO, the whole thing falls apart. So go in and look at that and take a careful look at your internal processes and make sure that they are consistent with the post-market guidance. Because if they are not, 806 efforts are not weak and light. It's heavy, it's effort laden, and it really means everybody in your team is going to be wearing the fireman hat for a good long time. You want to go to the next? Thank you.
All right, labeling. So labeling in cybersecurity.
Labeling is one of my favorite pieces of what FDA reviews because I have very mixed feelings about it. It is important that you be transparent with your users about how to use your device safely, effectively, and securely. But we also know that most users get that manual and they toss it in a drawer and they never look at it again. Or they skim through it, figure, I know how to do this, and they never look at it again. Or they only pull it out when there's an error code and they want to go look it up and say, what does error 86 mean? FDA reviewers spend a massive amount of time reviewing labeling because they want to make sure that it meets certain criteria, that it's usable by the intended audience, that it is in English in the United States. that it covers all of the elements it's required to cover, including cybersecurity now. It's also supposed to stay at or below an 8th grade reading level. Think about that for a minute. How easy is it to talk about cybersecurity in an 8th grade reading level?
Well, in my family, we talk about it all the time. Like my 12-year-old was just asking me about discrete math and modular exponentiation. So
I love it.
So all the time.
Your family sounds like my family. Wow, are we nerdy? My kids hear cybersecurity at the dinner table all the time, and they also hear a lot about medical device regulation. My husband is also formerly affiliated with the FDA, so they roll their eyes a lot at us. But all joking aside, what this means is that your 85-year-old mother, grandmother, aunt, whatever, needs to be able to read that label and not panic and call you and say, oh my God, do I need to have my pacemaker removed? How many people in the room have gotten a call like that? I thought so. I've gotten calls like that too. I have neighbors who are not as old as that, who ask me questions about medical devices all the time. If they're not able to read that label and make sense of it, they may get confused, they may lose trust, they may not use the device, or they may misuse it. These are all things you should be worried about.
All right. Well, as we get toward the final bingo category of controls, we actually have bingo cards we'll hand out later for people who are local. And who knows, maybe you'll get to shout bingo. But talking about controls, there's, well, in guidance documents, you often see this notion of controlled risk, uncontrolled risk. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I think there's often a lot of misunderstanding about vulnerabilities and such.
Yeah, so that's a little bit different than the actual controls that FDA is looking for initially in your pre-market submission, but it's really important. If you think you have uncontrolled risk in your device, what you're really saying by definition, according to the post-market guidance, is that there is residual risk that your device design does not control for inherently, that you cannot compensate for through notifications of user actions that can be taken, and that there is a serious problem out there in the wild in your ecosystem. If you know that that's your situation, you better call out your fire drill team and start acting on it immediately. A lot of people mistakenly think that there are controlled risks, ones for which there are mitigating circumstances, that are uncontrolled because they don't have complete control over the rollout of the compensation. That's not the right way to think about it. As long as you are notifying people and giving them the information, you have in some way transferred that risk to them. You have to make sure that they can use the information correctly. But for example, during Urgent 11, I called up IVD manufacturers and I said, are you affected? And if they said yes, I said, can you unplug your device from the network and it can still work? And if they said yes, I said, do it right now. Notify all your customers, tell them to unplug it from the network. If they have to scribble it down on a Post-it note to carry it over to the EHR and type it in, that's what they'll do. But get that thing off the network. Can you, as a medical device manufacturer, ensure that every single user has done that? No. But if you notified them and explained to them the consequences, remote code execution on the device, they're going to do it because they'll believe you and they don't want that device to fail. So as a fact, that is a controlled risk now. You have controlled it by informing the user to unplug it from the network.
Right. So on a specific control, Naomi, let's say I'm a manufacturer and I've decided I'm going to control the integrity of my software or some data within it, or maybe a software update. And I say, well, I'm using, and I'm going to break my own rule here, I'm going to use an acronym, but and this is speaking to the technologists out there, more of the engineering community. I'm going to use the MD5 hashing algorithm, and I've also included a CRC code to ensure the secure integrity of this device. What's your reaction to that?
Well, cyclical redundancy checks aren't very good at integrity. They're really there to tell you that you had a bit flip during data transfer. So please don't call that data integrity. It's not wrong. It's just not quite right. MD5 is kind of old. We're not using that as a hashing function anymore because people figured out how to break it. So please use something more modern. Go look at what NIST.
We've got a comment from the audience. Jack Kufal, CISO of Michigan Medicine. 1991. He says it's from 1991, and that's the end of the conversation.
1991 is making me feel old because I was a freshman in college back then.
I mean, even wine from 1991 is corked. So is your algorithm. Okay.
I like that. The analogy holds. It's probably going to give off a smell like vinegar and maybe not what you were looking for. So, bottom line, if that's what you're using, it's better than absolutely nothing, but not by very much. It means that your device integrity controls are going to fail at some point if somebody tests the boundaries and discovers that they can get in there, which means that they may be able to install a different variation of the software than the one you wanted installed, and you may not be able to tell. You want to know that the right version of the software is on there and that it's your version and not somebody else's. You don't want somebody running non-OEM software on your components and then they fail and you get blamed for it. It could happen.
Yeah. So we can continue with some of the specifics of these common ways to get what I would sort of translate to deficiency letters. Right. So if you get a deficiency letter as a manufacturer related to cybersecurity, what can you expect? Obviously, this maps to it. I'll also just say for those in the audience who have questions, just raise your hand. And if you're online, submit through the Q&A. And I see we have one question locally. I'm going to pass my microphone over to Veronica.
And we'll just share this mic back and forth as needed.
We'll just sing like, okay.
I'm not singing. You don't want to hear that.
Name and affiliation.
I'm Andrew Ginter with Waterfall Security Solutions. I was fascinated by your use of the word reasonable. The FDA is a big organization. They have, I assume, a great many requests every year to look at devices, to look at medical, pharmaceutical products, to look at things and ask the question, is public safety protected reasonably here? Across a wide range of consequence from, you compromise a pharmaceutical manufacturer, you may wind up with mass casualty events versus, all the way down to nuisance, as you said. Has the FDA published a framework for that? Because I work with heavy industry. This is my first exposure to the medical environment. In heavy industry, a lot of people talk about risk tolerance, which, to me makes little sense when you have, let's say, 2 power plants. In this example, maybe 2 hospitals serving similar populations, similar size, similar design, similar worst case consequences of compromise. Yet one does security very differently from the other because they have a different risk tolerance. To me, that makes sense when you're making decisions about the business. It makes way less sense when you're making decisions about public safety. And to me, the FDA mandate is to protect public safety. What would help enormously across a great many industries, and I suspect in this industry, is if there was a framework saying, look, when you have a mass casualty event that could be triggered by this kind of threat, this class of threat is credible. That class of bizarreness, we're saying, is out of scope for now. It might change. This will have to be a living document. But is there a framework that can explain what is reasonable across a wide spectrum of consequence, across a wide spectrum of kinds of systems, across a wide spectrum of credible threat?
Do you want to start?
Oh, I don't have a mic.
Oh, cop out. That's okay. Sure. The answer is yes, but it's not as simple as a framework. The reality is that the quality system regulation and the way that FDA regulates medical devices means that there are actually multiple things that you have to apply. When they're evaluating the safety of a device, they are looking at your 14971 safety risk assessment at an overall system level, your system level hazard analysis for clinical impact. That's the patient safety aspect. There are other aspects that relate to operator safety. 60601-1 was mentioned earlier. I'm a huge fan. Worked on standards quite a bit while I was at FDA. Those relate to things like, if I drop this on my foot, am I going to break all my bones? Can I shock myself? And if I shock myself, is it, oops, static electricity and it hurts for a few seconds, or oops, I just touched power and that's really not good for you, and it can cause some pretty serious injuries. So yes, there are frameworks. Now, with respect to cybersecurity related safety, the guidance gives you some very clear direction on what you're supposed to be doing and how you're supposed to do it. But it also says that you have to hand off the safety impact aspects back to that safety related standard 14971. You do not have your cybersecurity SMEs sit down and assess the clinical impact. You assess the data impact and hand it over to the clinical team to assess the safety to the patient impact. Why? Because cybersecurity experts are not clinicians. I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on TV. I'm also not a lawyer. I don't play one of those either. When we talk about regulation, I can talk about it as the regulator, but we're usually not lawyers. In the same vein, when a medical device team of regulators reviews your device, the medical decision-making is not coming from the lead reviewer or a software consulting reviewer. It's coming from a medical officer, and she or he is a clinician. So there is a teamwork effect in play on the regulator side, and there is an expectation that there is a teamwork activity going on the developer side. You have to hand over the risks in the right way, and you have to evaluate them from the right perspective. Does that help?
All right, we got a thumbs up. So I'm getting a signal that we may have a question online. Is that right? Oh, okay. So we'll turn to a couple questions online for the moment and then keep dovetailing. So go ahead, Christopher.
Yeah, so our first online question is, SBOM for software as a medical device has thousands of components. Does FDA expect us to provide support levels for each component? They're generally not easily available by vendors.
Well, my answer is,
why, yes. Yes, it does. Man, Kevin, you're really going to hand off to me. That's okay. I'm prepared for this question. So the answer is yes. I have thousands of components in a very complex medical device, and I may have them layered where it's sort of like Russian nesting dolls. You've got a little one inside a bigger one inside a really big one. And if you're doing a good job of tracking that, kudos to you because you're ahead of a lot of people. But bottom laying, whatever software components you, as a developer, put into your device, you need to track them. Why? Because something nested 4 layers down may, in fact, have a vulnerability, which may also be associated with what's called a KEV, a known exploited vulnerability, which means that there's somebody out there who's already figured out how to do it, and they're going to try if they figure out you're vulnerable. What do you do with thousands of components when you're unsure about level of support? Boy, automated tooling would be amazing here. You better find some tooling. Trying to write it yourself may not be the best approach. Reach out and ask people in your field who know something about tooling and ask them if they found a way. Hint, yes, people have found a way. You want to get as much information as you can, but you don't need to break your neck trying to find it all. So you're going to sit there and search the internet for every single component manually by typing the name of it in and seeing if you can get level of support? Probably not. Is that a reasonable effort? Based on your question earlier about reasonable, it might not be reasonable to do that. But FDA wants you to at least say, I don't know, but because I don't know, I'm watching this package carefully and I can maintain it myself. That's a good answer, and it's completely acceptable. Saying not applicable, don't do that. Not applicable just means I don't care, and FDA doesn't want to hear that.
Well, I've just learned why I didn't realize my mother named me after a known exploited vulnerability, but that's very interesting. Did I hear we have another question? Oh, did we have a hand go up? Did I miss? If we could pass the mic to the back, and name and affiliation, please.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Samir. I'm from Vapotherm. So just follow up for the previous question. So when we are talking about thousands of components, we also have a guidance from FDA for OTS used in software medical devices. And then we are asked to perform risk assessment of those components. So are we also going to do risk assessment of all those components, or is there an easy way to bucket all of them to reduce the work for MDMs?
Great question. Is there a way to bucket them? OTS is off the shelf. So you're using a Microsoft operating system that would be considered off the shelf software. If you're using MATLAB, and I've seen MATLAB used in quite a few medical devices, that's off the shelf software. If you're using LabVIEW, stop it. I'm sorry. It's okay. You can use LabVIEW. You just better be really good at it. Please don't use LabVIEW. All joking aside, you do need to know what's in there, and you need to know about each of the pieces. It's really important to do that. How do you track them all down? How far do you go down the rabbit hole? The SBOM community forum from CISA said it's turtles all the way down. It's a fractal problem. You do need to have some attention to it. When you don't know something, it's better to say that you don't know it and then give a sense of what your plan is. It's not easy to manage that many components though, right? I mean, that's the problem here. If I have 2,000 components and there are 13 vulnerabilities on average associated with them, it's a lot of stuff to track. Some of those may be false positives too, though. So make sure you're using good tooling and that it's actually giving you the kind of output that you need. Make sure you're actually validating the tooling or verifying its output. Key pieces.
I'll just offer one story related to the 1,000 pieces. So it sounds a bit like when I was a kid, but when I was a kid, one of my office mates at the time was working with neurosurgeons and building monitoring devices for neurosurgery. And they were using X Windows at the time. Windows was like Windows 3.1 or something. So X Windows was still kind of popular. But they decided for being able to argue about the safety of the system, they removed entire components of the X Windows code because they just decided, you know what, if we had less code, it's easier to analyze. So they removed the ability for the clinician to move the window on the screen because they decided they don't need that. I'm not saying that's the right decision, but they did that to simplify. And so when it comes to security, it's so much easier to argue, not just security, right? Safety as well, just general safety. The less there is, the fewer things that go wrong through interactions.
But let's go back to that bucketing question for a minute. What can you do and how can you describe it to FDA? You remember all those things in the guidance about architecture diagrams? I love modularity. I'm a huge fan of Legos. Tell me how the software components fit into modules of your system and how those relate to essential performance and basic safety. Again, 60601 words there. It's a standard about basic safety and essential performance. If you can tell me that 12 of my Lego bricks have nothing to do with basic safety or essential performance, then you can take every software component in those buckets and group them together and give me your justification and stop paying attention to them for safety impact. Trace that through your software bill of materials and show me where and how you did that. And then we stop paying attention to those, or we pay less attention to them. And then we take the other 8 Legos that have some essential performance or safety implication, and we do the risk analysis on those as modules. And then we look at the 800 software components in them only as needed because we've done it on a modular level. That is much, much simpler and it's easy to justify. And if you do a good architectural diagram, FDA will agree with your approach in general. Now, you may run across somebody who is being unreasonable. We're going to go back to that word reasonable. And if that were to happen, there are mechanisms for dealing with it. You can raise the flag with your reviewer. You can call their manager. If you really want to go there, you can call the ombudsman. That's not quite the nuclear option, but it's getting close. If you raise a flag and you say, hey, I think this is unreasonable, and you start talking about why, typically your reviewer will listen to you, hear you out, and either explain why they disagree with you, which may happen, or they will change their perspective and have a different point of view. But you better have a really good architecture diagram. And again, I'm a big fan of visual aids. I'm a visual person myself. So if you draw me a nice diagram and you're missing big pieces, I'm not going to trust it. But if you draw me a nice diagram and I can tell how it goes back to your design and your implementation, your design specs, your requirements, then I think we're in the good place.
Okay, thanks for your question. And I can say, if you want to be anonymous, that's fine as well. Did I hear we had another online question?
Yeah, there's one more quick one. A couple people were asking, when the part you're talking about the 806 exemption, there's a couple acronyms like ISAC. I was wondering if you could describe those for the folks online and those in the class as well.
Great question. ISACs and ISAOs, they are information sharing and analysis centers or organizations. We have already been talking about it here today, but the big one is the Health ISAC, HISAC. There are also ISAOs in each of the critical infrastructure areas where ones have been stood up, and they tend to be a little bit smaller, a little bit more lightweight. There is a Med ISAO in this space that you can rely on if you are not a member of HISAC. If you are a member of neither of them, that is a choice that you are making, and just be warned that it could potentially cause you problems downstream, but it's not required by anyone in the United States. I've never heard it being required anywhere else either, but I'm not all that familiar with requirements in other parts of the world.
Some folks are asking if we can share the slide deck online.
Oh.
If they can access this.
Okay, so there's always a question for online. If you're online, we post a video, which you'll be able to see the slides in the video, but the slides themselves are not included. It'll typically take a week or so for those slides in the form of a YouTube video to show up online. Okay, so we have only about 3 or 4 minutes left. I have some more questions for Naomi, but I also want to give a chance for anyone online or in person to ask any questions. But I wanted to turn to deficiency letters because, I mean, the big picture here is you submit a 510K, a PMA or whatnot, and you get back a cybersecurity deficiency letter. And maybe it's your first cybersecurity deficiency letter, and you're really shocked because of the degree of detail and precision of why it's been deemed deficient. So maybe you could just take us through, you get one of these letters, what's the timing like? What are typical interactions that happen after you receive that letter? Do you usually just get one deficiency? Will there be 50? What's sort of the Gaussian distribution here of things to expect if you have a deficiency?
Ooh, Gaussian distribution. What we have heard FDA say publicly is that when people get cybersecurity deficiencies in their deficiency letter, which often encompasses other elements of review as well, when they get them, on average, they're getting 15 of them. Now, the total list of stock deficiencies is somewhere around 34. So you're getting close to 50% of them. They're throwing the kitchen sink at you. Why are they throwing the kitchen sink at you? Because you have not demonstrated to them the elements that they are asking for. They may already be baked into your system and you just didn't describe them well, or you may actually not be as mature as you should be. In either case, the timeline is fixed in terms of how much time you have from FDA to respond, typically. And FDA's review timeline is governed by MDUFA funding goals. So industry is part of the funding for FDA reviewers. Because of that, industry wants expectations to be met in terms of timeline. For a 510K, approximately FDA should send you a deficiency letter by day 60. You have a fixed amount of time to respond to that. If on day 179 you're not ready, you have one more day. If on day 180 you haven't responded, FDA deletes your submission from their database and you're gone, and you'll have to try again, and you'll have to pay again. So what do you do about it when you get a deficiency letter that contains the kitchen sink? First of all, if you don't know what to do about it, go find somebody who does and ask for help. Second, separate the deficiencies into two buckets. Do we have the information but failed to give it to FDA? Bucket A, relatively easy to respond to. Bucket B, we didn't actually include security controls, and our risk assessment says we should have done so. That's called redesign, and that takes a lot longer, and you better get started really quickly. So you need to look at these things from the perspective of, how do I triage? This is an emergency situation. How do I triage? How do I figure out what things I can deal with fastest? And if necessary, how do I describe to FDA a plan to remediate problems that I can't resolve in 180 days? Let's say that one more time. Sometimes, under the right circumstances, you can convince FDA that you have a plan that you can't execute quite that fast for how you're going to fix the problems that they've pointed out to you. And sometimes, given the risk-benefit analysis, that can be okay. Not all the time. It depends on the risk and the benefit of the device. So it's really important that when you get that deficiency letter, you call in all hands on deck. You bring your stakeholders together, regulatory, quality, cybersecurity, software team if they're separate, R&D team if they're separate, clinical, and you sit down together and you figure it out. How bad is it? Is it something that I just didn't document right? Or is it something that requires a redesign? And how fast can I do that? And your poor systems engineering lead is going to be ripping her hair out, trying to figure out how to squeeze that into a timeline that already has other product design on it.
And speaking of timelines, we're actually out of time. So I guess you'll have to talk to Naomi in person if you want to get the full answer. That's the quick one. But I wanted to thank all of our online questions and the questions here locally. We'll certainly continue these conversations in the hallway. So thank you, Naomi, for joining us on the program. And we'll be back in a month for the next CERC event. So thank you all. And we'll close out the webinar.